Okay, so this review video here is about the parts of the cell. So parts of the cell, pretty much we're looking at eukaryotic cells and we're looking at their organelles. So the organelles I like to think of like the organs, right? Each one has its own particular job, but together they pretty much keep the cell going. So first thing we want to look at is cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is this liquid area that holds everything in place. It also helps with moving stuff in and out of the cell. So this cytoplasm is all this light blue stuff right here where there's no organelles, and inside the cell mostly like a watery liquid, okay? And what it does is it kind of keeps everything in place, almost like a jello mold, right? You see that jello mold that has the fruit in it, okay? This cytoplasm keeps all that stuff there. Now, organelles kind of perform specific tasks. And to be more specific about it, think of them like the organs in your body, right? Each organ does its own job. The heart, the liver, the intestines. Each one does a particular job to keep the whole body running. Now, the same thing happens in the cell. We have our nucleus, our endoplasmic reticulum, our Golgi bodies, our mitochondria, and each one of these things does a specific task to keep the cell alive. Now, we want to talk about two different types of cells. So our first one, prokaryotes. These are cells with no nucleus, as well as no nuclear bound membranes, and they're much more simple, okay? And evolutionarily speaking, prokaryotes are the cells that came around first. Now, a prokaryotic cell, it's a very simple cell, and bacteria is a good example of this. So prokaryotic cells, its DNA is not enclosed in any sort of structure. It's just kind of floating around in the cell. And sometimes we have, little circles or what are called plastids kind of floating around, pieces of DNA. But this DNA is not in any sort of nucleus, okay? We call that chromatin. Now, there's also these little things that make proteins in these cells. And these things are our ribosomes. Okay, those are in the cell, all right? And what else they have are sometimes they have these little tiny hairs coming off the cell. And these little tiny hairs aid in movement, and they're called cilia. Now, if they're short hairs, they're cilia. If we have sometimes these long ones, those are what are called flagella. All right? Now, our eukaryotic cell, much more complex. So it's enclosed by a cell membrane, both of these are. But, for example, eukaryotic cells, the big distinguishing factor that we have is that they have a nucleus, okay? And they have nuclear-bound membranes. So much more complex as well. So when we draw these, right, we have our cell membrane. Big distinguishing factor is our nucleus, which has our DNA located in it. Now, they also have these other membrane-bound organelles, the endoplasmic reticulum, okay, the Golgi bodies. Okay, we have our mitochondria spread about. All right, we have our centrioles, which aid in division. So there's all these different types. As you can see, it's much more complex in this scenario. All right, now our nucleus, I like to call this the control center. And the reason I call it the control center is that this is where our DNA is housed, okay? It's stored in this location. So our nucleus in this picture is this structure right here, okay? You'll notice that it has a nuclear envelope around it. You can also see these little tiny holes called nuclear pores. But more specifically, when we look at this, the center of this has this DNA in it, okay? So when we have uncoiled DNA, we call that chromatin. And chromatin is when the cell is not in its dividing state. Chromatin is found inside the nucleus. Now, chromosomes are when we have coiled or condensed DNA. All right? And usually it looks something like this. They look like little tiny X's. Okay? And when it coils up, it does that because when these guys split, Okay, half goes to one side, half goes to the other. That's how we split our cells. So chromosomes are only around in cell division. So our nucleus located right here, okay, that whole thing. Now inside the nucleus we have this thing called the nucleolus. And the nucleolus is the site where ribosomes are made. More specifically, ribosomal DNA. All right, and as you can see, the ribosome is this condensed area of DNA at the center of the cell. Okay, so inside of the nucleus, we have this very tightly packed area. That is our nucleolus at the center, and that is where our ribosomal DNA is made. So, talking about that ribosomal DNA, what ribosomes are is this is the site of protein synthesis. And what protein synthesis means is this is where proteins are made. Now, these are ribosomes right here. They are formed freely in the cytoplasm. So they're located in two spots. They're located in the cytoplasm, and they're also located on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. I'm just going to abbreviate that, rough ER. And our ER, endoplasmic reticulum, is attached to the nucleus, and it's kind of tough to see here, but what you should see is these little tiny dots all over these endoplasmic reticulum. And that's what we call the smooth ER, okay? Or I'm sorry, the rough ER. Rough, it's like sandpaper, it has a texture to it. So our endoplasmic reticulum, what this is an intercellular highway. So what it does is it moves molecules in the cell, okay? So if we want to circle this, our endoplasmic reticulum is composed of two parts here. We have our smooth and our rough, all right? So the one I'm circling in purple, that's going to be our rough ER, and the one I'm circling in green would be our smooth ER, okay? It's kind of easier to see down here. You see all these little dots? Those are the ribosomes attached to it. That's our rough ER. Okay, the ones where it's kind of smooth, nothing attached, that's our smooth ER. So our rough ER, what the rough ER does is it produces phospholipids and proteins. And it makes sense that it makes proteins is because these ribosomes are attached to it. Now, the smooth ER, it builds lipids. And what happens is when these molecules are built inside these membranes, they usually get transported within the cell somewhere for its final modification. And so next we have our mitochondria. Now mitochondria, you'll probably often hear it referred to as the powerhouse. Now, I don't really like this term. I mean, it works for middle school, but what this actually means is mitochondria produces something called ATP, okay? And ATP is the energy source our cells use. So ATP is produced or made inside of the nucleus. So that is why it's called the powerhouse of the cell. So this is what mitochondria looks like. It's double membraned, and on the inside we have this membrane and these folds, and these folds are called cristae. Okay, and these cristae, what they do is they are active sites for ATP production. Okay, so inside of our nucleus, these mitochondria are yellow here. They almost look like kidney beans. Okay, and you'll notice that these folds are very prevalent, and that's a very good way to distinguish what are the mitochondria and what are other things. Now, our Golgi bodies, they're another molecule that modifies the cell. So they modify compounds in the cell, and what they do is when they modify them, they send them out of the cell by these things called vesicles. And vesicles sounds like vehicles because they transport them. These are vesicles right here. They're little tiny membrane-bound sacs that move stuff to their different location. So here's a picture of it right here. This is a picture of the Golgi bodies. Now, if we look for it inside of the cell, it's located right here. Now, a lot of people confuse Golgi bodies and endoplasmic reticulum. The difference is the endoplasmic reticulum is attached to the nucleus, whereas the Golgi body is not. So the Golgi body is our final modification, and it sends it usually out of the cell to be used by other parts. And what it does is it maintains homeostasis. Now, our cell membrane is the thing that surrounds the cell. Okay, it's a very thin layer that surrounds the cell. Okay, and the cell membrane is very important, and it's the outer wall, or I shouldn't say wall, outer layer of the cell. Okay, now, first of all, this is made of things called phospholipids. And phospholipids are a structure that kind of looks like this. It's composed of a head and two tails, and that's kind of reviewed in the parts of the cell molecules. Now, this phospholipid, it forms what's known as a bilayer, okay? And that bilayer, which means that it's made of two layers of these phospholipids. So why this is kind of important is because these heads here are what are known as hydrophilic, which means water-loving. So they're associated with the inside and the outside of the cell. That's what interacts with water. These tails are hydrophobic. They don't like water, so they kind of associated with each other to stay away from the water. Now, the cell membrane is what's known as selectively permeable. And what this means is that the cell membrane only allows certain materials in and out. Okay, so like water can flow freely in and out of the cell, but like large molecules such as glucose need some other way to get in. This is what selectively permeable is, like a gated community. Certain people are allowed in, no problem. Other people get stopped and are not allowed in. The cell wall is only found in plant cells, and that's kind of an important thing here. But the cell wall, what it does is it supports and protects plant cells, and plant is our key word here. All right, so those plant cells, it's located, let's get here, this outside layer of the plant. Now on the inside there still is a cell membrane, okay, but it's not the outside layer like in our animals. So it's much more rigid. This cell membrane, or the cell wall, is what Mr. Hooke observed. I can't talk. It's what he observed when he first coined the term cells, because he thought they looked like little prison cells. Okay? Now, a vacuole, which I'll highlight here in blue, is pretty much like a big storage tank. All right? So a vacuole is a storage unit, like a vacuum, sucks it up and keeps it in that area for plants. And what it stores are things like water, waste, and enzymes. And what happens is this water, waste, and enzyme, it gets stored in this location because plants, they can't move to get their food. So plants have a large vacuole, okay? And it has a large vacuole, much larger than the animal cell. Next, we want to look at chloroplast. Now, chloroplast is what makes plants green. Now, chloroplast is the site of photosynthesis. And what photosynthesis is pretty much the plant making sugar molecules from CO2 and water. As you can see here, this is a cartoon of it here. You can see these stacks here. What you see here is all these little different chloroplasts inside of plant cells. You can see the cell wall, very distinguishing feature right there. Okay? Again, site of photosynthesis, making those sugar from carbohydrates and water. Now, the importance here is mitochondria and chloroplast they both contain their own DNA. And what this means is that the DNA inside of these two structures is different than the plant or than the host DNA. So what it tells us is that it evolves separately from our cells in general. But what's important here is that if we look at these two organelles, right? Chloroplast, what happens is chloroplast produces glucose and oxygen, okay? So the mitochondria uses that glucose and oxygen to produce ATP. And once that happens, it produces CO2 and water. Now, the thing is that that's exactly what the chloroplasts use. So us breathing out CO2 and water, that's what the plants use to make glucose and oxygen. It's kind of a big cycle of using the waste products of each other. This is why plants and animals, they kind of evolve together so that they support each other. Well, this is a little review on the parts of the cell. Hopefully this helps and allows you to do better on your upcoming test. This is Mr. O'Brien, signing off.